It used to be said that it was impossible for a human to spend 1 second in the air when they jump. In fact, up to a certain point, there was never a high quality video of a human spending over a second in the air on any jump in any sport. However, I just found 2 of them, and they might be the highest jumpers of all time. Before I show you who they are, let me explain to you why flight time even mattered. And afterwards, I'll show you exactly what makes these 2 jumpers so special and how you can become more like them. Flight time is directly proportional to how high you can jump. So no, that old head at the park who says he doesn't jump high, but his hang time is crazy. That old head is completely wrong. The reason we know he's wrong is because of something called kinematics. Kinematics is a physics branch that explains motion, specifically motion without the effects of force on that motion. And kinematics gives us these equations. And you can move these equations around to show that how high you jump is directly proportional to your final velocity at toe off of a jump. And this is directly proportional to your vertical displacement, which is just a fancy way of saying how high you are in the air. This shows us that you can calculate your vertical jump purely based off of your flight time. Let me show you how you can do that. The easiest way is to take a video and then count how many frames you spent in the air. Every video is literally just a bunch of pictures put together in quick succession. The more pictures or frames that video takes in 1 second, the smoother that video is going to be. That's how those like super expensive cameras that do the hyper slow-mos get such a smooth slow-mo. It's because the frame rate on those videos are insanely high. The higher the frame rate of a video, the more accurate your flight time is going to be. To measure your flight time, you want to use a video that is at least at 120 frames per second, and ideally it's at 240 frames per second. From there, you're either gonna put your video into an editing software. I use Final Cut Pro if I'm using my computer, and on the phone, there's an app called My Jump 2 that costs about 10 bucks, and it actually counts the frames for you. If you can't afford $10 on an app, I want you to go knock on 100 doors right now. Go outside, knock on 100 doors, and tell them that you'll mow their lawn for 10 bucks. I guarantee you're gonna get at least one answer. If you can't afford THP, you should do the same thing. So now you either have editing software and an app that you can use to count the frames. Now you're going to record one of your jumps, you're gonna put it in that app, and you're gonna find the last frame that your feet are on the ground. So this frame right here is the last frame that my feet are on the ground. The very next frame looks like this. My feet are off the ground. You're gonna start counting when your feet are still on the ground. This is why having a higher frame rate matters so much. Because look at this video. This video is in 30 frames per second. Look at this frame. This is the last frame on the video that my feet are on the ground for. I'm not even close to being on my toes. And then the next frame, boom, they're already off the ground. So that's why it's so inaccurate to use a low frame rate video versus if you have a video that's like hypothetically 10,000 frames per second, you're gonna be able to find the exact minuscule little bit that your feet are on the ground. And that is gonna be frame 0. That is gonna be where you're gonna start counting. The very next frame is 1. Then the next frame is 2, and so on and so forth. And you're gonna keep counting them until you find the first frame that your feet touch the ground again. It's the last frame you count. So when we look at this jump, I start counting here, and then here is the final frame. Whatever frame you got to, divide that number by the frame rate of the video. So let's say I was in the air for 100 frames. I would divide that by 120 if I'm using a 120 FPS video. Then we just plug this number into this nifty kinematic equation that we moved around to give us vertical, and it'll spit out a number that'll tell you your vertical jump. However, this number isn't super accurate because when you measure your vertical with your standard max touch vertical jump test, your reach is measured flat-footed. However, look when we started counting for your flight time. You are all the way up on your toes. So we don't take into account the feet, right? When we do a max touch vertical jump test. This means that the flight time kinematic equation style of figuring out your vertical can give you a vertical that's a few inches lower than your max touch vertical jump. By the way, this is also why the max touch test biases athletes with bigger feet. Because if someone has massive feet, they might have 2 extra inches of reach compared to someone with really small feet, even though they might have the same standing reach flat-footed. Something else that can make this test inaccurate is your landing and takeoff position. Your landing and takeoff position can affect how long you are in the air for. If you land with a high center of mass, so this is an example of landing with a low center of mass. You see his legs are bent, they're super hinged, their arms are low. And this is landing with a super high center of mass. He's on one foot, the other knee is super high in the air, his hands are up in the air. That's gonna give him a way lower flight time. Similarly, how you take off will affect it. One-footers take off with one knee super high in the air, and this is also gonna decrease their flight time. And this is also why one-footers usually don't have insanely high flight times, because they're taking off of the higher center of mass and they're usually landing on one leg, super off balance, hands up in the air, which is also really high center of mass. On the other hand, if you land with both arms low, hinged over, bent legs, this can also exaggerate your flight time. I actually recently found a video on Instagram the other day of this guy who was testing his athletes on a jump mat before, and then he was posting how much they improved, but when you look at their jumps, he actually just taught them to land with a way lower landing position, which is just inflating their after measurements. This is why using flight time to calculate your vertical has good inter-rater reliability. So it's good for comparing yourself to yourself and seeing your progress over time. Because typically we land, unless you're doing it on purpose, you land in the same ways every time on the same types of jump. For example, look at my max jump tests from 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, 2025. I'm landing in the exact same way each time. So my flight time measurements are actually pretty accurate. I can roughly have a good estimate of how high I'm jumping based on the flight time, but I don't take it as law. What it's good for is corroborating vertical jump test measurements, right? So if an athlete tests a 50, but then their flight time is in the low 0.9s, that probably means that they cheated their reach on the test. Having said that, for 2-foot jumpers that are landing in a relatively high position, and the main thing is, are they landing with their legs relatively straight? They're not super hinged over. Are their arms at their waist or above? If all those check boxes are checked, you can usually guess how high they're jumping based on their flight times. And this is just from seeing hundreds of athletes test on a vert trainer. By the way, you can get for 10% off if you use the code THP. Seeing how high they jump and then looking at their flight times and just seeing the correlation. I've seen those literally hundreds, maybe thousands of times at this point. And I can usually just have a very good guess on how high they would test just by looking at their flight times, seeing their landing positions, making adjustments based off of that. Having said that, if you're a 2-foot jumper with a relatively high landing position, if your flight time's at 0.96 or higher, you're probably in that 49 to 50 range. For reference, this is my highest jump ever. That was in the mid 0.98s. Donovan Hawkins recently had what I thought was the highest jump in terms of flight time that I've ever seen, and that was 0.99. And then I found these two freak athletes. And the first jump, I actually was there in person. I witnessed this with my two very own eyes. We were at Venice Beach and we were doing the bell touch. And the bell touch is super inaccurate because they get this like stick to measure it, but the stick is at an angle and they tell you it's 12 feet, but the thing's at like a 45-degree angle. So anytime you see any test from Venice Beach, they're probably capping about what the height of the bell is based on flight time. This jump is over a second in the air, which just from the eye test looks insane. And for reference, a jump that's over a second in the air probably would mean about a 51-inch jump if it's right at a second, maybe even a 52-inch jump. The second athlete that I saw, and this is another athlete I've seen with my two very own eyes, is Isaiah Espinoza, and he recently tested an official 50-inch vertical jump. And the reason I say it's official is because it was in a competition where they measured the measurement device and they also measured his reach. We called and made sure that they were stretching his arm on the reach test. Very, very accurate way of measuring. He's only the third athlete ever to test above a 50 in a way that's measured officially. I'm talking measuring the vertex, measuring the reach right before on camera for both things. So super legit test. And he had a flight time of a second on his best jump on that day. If you just look at how they jump, they're both very different. Anthony Height shorts his penultimate, uses a ton of speed. Isaiah Espinoza has more traditional good jump technique, right? Long split on his penultimate. He's a right-left jumper. They're also very different heights. Anthony Height is 5'6", Isaiah Espinoza is 5'10". They're both very light. Anthony Height was a freak, didn't lift a single weight. Isaiah Espinoza trained a lot with weights and plyometrics, but still not super insanely strong, right? He's only 20 years old and hasn't had a lot of time to develop crazy strength in the weight room. But he is really strong for how much he weighs and when compared to the average athlete. What makes these two athletes so different is their tendons and their nervous system. To jump really high, you need really stiff tendons. Stiff tendons are hard to stretch, but when they are stretched, they store a lot of energy that is released when it recoils very powerfully, very quickly. However, in order to stretch these stiff tendons, you need very powerful muscles. And by power, I just mean being able to produce a ton of force in a short amount of time, right? When you jump, this jump by Anthony Height He spent 0.23 seconds on the ground from the moment his plant leg hit the ground to toe off of the jump, which is unheard of. For reference, the shortest time I've ever spent on a jump was 0.26 seconds. My average is around 0.28 seconds. Most 2-foot jumpers are 0.3 seconds and above. 0.23 seconds is on par with a good 1-foot power jumper. That's insane. That is so fast on the ground. That is literally like no time on the ground. That means he barely has any time to produce force. So you can be extremely strong, but if you can't produce that force in a short amount of time, you're not gonna be able to jump high. The more force you can produce in that little bit of time, the more time you have to stretch that tendon and thus jump really high. Now, tendon stiffness is mainly determined by your genetics, but the best way to stiffen them isn't what you think. A lot of athletes think that it's jumping and plyos, but it's actually lifting. Lifting has been shown in research time and time again to stiffen your tendons up. But the best way to improve the efficiency of your nervous system, and your nervous system innervates your muscles, right? Your nervous system dictates how many muscle fibers you recruit, how quickly they're recruited, how synchronized your muscles fire together, the coordination. Your nervous system dictates all of that. So you need to train your nervous system if you want to jump higher. Speaking of which, if you go to THPstrength.com, me and my team will coach you personally to stiffen your tendons up, get a more efficient nervous system, get you to reach your genetic potential. So if you're interested in that, go to THPstrength.com, use the code SPRING for 20% off of your first month of training. Having said that, the best way that you can train your nervous system is through plyometrics. Plyometrics are exercises that are built to overload the stretch shortening cycle. Stretch shortening cycle is a really fast eccentric action followed by a fast concentric action. Eccentric just means your musculotendinous unit is stretching under load, and then the concentric action means it's shortening under load. The stretch shortening cycle leverages those eccentric contractions to stretch the tendon to produce way more force than you could by moving slowly or with a concentric action. It allows you to store way more energy in the tendon. When we train, we want to cause an overload. We want to subject your body to something it's not used to so that it can adapt and become better at the thing that you are overloading. Plyometrics are awesome because they allow us to overload the stretch shortening cycle. And we can do this by changing a few variables. For example, we can change the speed at which you do the plyometric. You can overload it through manipulating gravity by jumping off of a box or by doing repeat jumps, right? You're gonna be landing with way higher forces, which is gonna cause a greater adaptation, and by moving with maximum intent. The reason Isaiah Spinoza and Anthony Hite can jump that high is because their body is naturally better at all these things. They have naturally very stiff tendons and extremely wired nervous systems that recruit their muscles and allow them to fire with more force, more quickly, so that they can stretch the tendons more than you or I can. Combine this with years and years and years of jumping, which is in of itself a plyometric that self-intensifies, right? As you jump more, you become better at jumping, which makes the jumps more intense, which causes a greater adaptation, which causes you to jump higher. And it's just a loop that keeps going over and over again. But we can learn from them, right? And luckily, research has shown that we can improve all these qualities that they're naturally good at. You or I might not have those same qualities naturally from birth, but you can maximize them and we can cause changes through training. Thanks for watching.